Hi guys, today I am here with my favourite books of 2019 video. I had a hard job whittling these down to only 10, but I have finally come to my decision after lots of moving about, and I cannot wait to talk to you about my top 10 books of the year. 2019 was a pretty decent reading year for me, and even though in places I didn't think that I had read as much as I'd wanted to, or I didn't think I'd read the books that I'd wanted to, when I look at this favourites list I can see just how high the quality of the books that I read were. So I won't keep you waiting, and I'm going to start by talking to you about my top 3 books of the year. Now, some booktubers like to keep you waiting until the end, but I'm not one of those people, because some of you might click away, and even though that's very sad, I want all of you, if possible, to stick around for the first 3, because these are the books I think everybody should read. So let's start with my favourite book of 2019, and I'm sure it will not come as a big surprise to many of you if you have watched my videos throughout the year, because my favourite book of the year is Howard's End by E.M. Forster. I fell in love with this book this year and I can't stop thinking about it, even though I read it quite early on. This is an Edwardian classic by E.M. Forster, who is probably my favourite Edwardian author. The Edwardian period is a really interesting time for literature because it really is the end of the old times, because in earlier periods like the Georgian, Regency and Victorian eras there are quite strict society rules, and this carries on at the end of the Victorian period into the Edwardian era. But by the end of the Edwardian period you get the sense that everything is changing, that people are becoming more individualistic, that society is changing and the rules are changing, and E.M. Forster fits quite neatly into this space. He is chronicling the change between the old and the new. And the reason that I love Howard's End so much is that you have 2 central characters, Margaret and Helen Schlegel, who are those figures of change, and yet parts of their personality and character also hark back to earlier eras and those rules. So really what E.M. Forster is doing is chronicling this changing period through his writing. And I think really it's one of the reasons that he didn't write much. He didn't write many books, particularly later on in his life. I think because so much had changed that it was very difficult to go back to that and to write about something that had already changed beyond recognition, particularly after the outbreak of war. It's also about 2 other families, the Wilcoxes and the Basts, and along with the Schlegels it looks at class division and how we can move outside of class, or whether in fact we can, and how meddling in other people's lives doesn't always work. Because at the heart of the book is E.M. Forster's concept of only connect, and I interpret only connect as the idea that all our actions have repercussions on other people, and so none of us act in isolation. So once one character meddles in the life of another, once one character becomes connected to another character in the book, this has knock-on effects down the line that keep happening in the book. And if you have read this and haven't watched the adaptation with Helena Bonham Carter and Emma Thompson, it is fantastic and I love it so much. And I'm hoping to watch the more recent adaptation soon, but I just love this book and can't get enough of it. An author who I discovered in 2019 was Eva Ibbotson, who is probably best known as a children's author, but she also wrote lots of adult novels, which often now are categorised as young adult novels because they are quite tame as adult novels go. But I read all of those books during the course of the year and I loved them so much. They were the perfect comfort reads. I got so much out of them, and she's now one of my very favourite authors. And my favourite of her books that I read this year was The Morning Gift. I don't even know where to start with this book because it is utter perfection. It's about a young Jewish woman called Ruth who is living in Vienna at the time of the Anschluss, when Austria was annexed, and in order to escape to England she marries a man man called Quinn, who is a university professor in science, and they agree to have this unconventional marriage which will then end up in their divorce in order to get her to safety across the channel. But obviously things don't go quite as planned for Ruth and Quinn, because they do have a lot more chemistry than they first had anticipated, and I think this is one of the best romances I have ever read, whilst also dealing with subjects like women in science, about the Second World War, and also about refugees. So there was a lot to unpack in here, a lot that I keep going back to. I have read this multiple times this year and I can't get enough of it. Every time I read it I get something new from it, and I think it's a very current, timely novel, even though it was written in the 1990s and set during the outbreak of war. So if you're looking for a good place to start with Eva Ibbetson's novels, look no further than The Morning Gift. And finally, in my top 3, another one that I'm sure won't be surprising is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. I read this recently and I cannot stop thinking about it. I don't think I've shut up about it since I finished reading it, and I just want to read everything by Edith Wharton now. This is set in 1870s New York after the American Civil War, but it was written after the First World War when Edith Wharton was living in Paris. So you get two narratives going on. You have the narrative that's happening in the book, but also Edith Wharton's own narrative as she's dealing with themes that she has dealt with over the past few years when she was helping out with the war effort. And even though you don't see that, even though she doesn't explicitly mention it, you do have many parallels running through the book and real life. The main characters are Ellen Olenska, who has just moved back to New York from Europe where her marriage has failed, and also Newland Archer, who is your typical New York male. He had been brought up in the society, knows exactly how he should act, but when he meets Ellen he realises that there might be more to life than this New York bubble they have been living in. It's a very passionate novel, very tense in places and dramatic, with absolutely gorgeous writing that I just wanted to read over and over again, and I could not put this down when I read it. So it's definitely not going to be the last Edith Wharton book I read. In fact, I think this might be the first book in a wonderful journey with Edith Wharton's writing. Another book that I recently read and again fell completely in love with was The Doll Factory by Elizabeth McNeil. This is a recent release. It's been published within the last year, and it is set during the Great Exhibition of the 1850s, and it centres around the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood with a fictional protagonist called Iris who works making dolls and is spotted by a fictional member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Louis Frost, who takes her on as his model. It draws on the life of Lizzie Siddal, who was a model for the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood but also was an artist in her own right, and so I liked the look at women's creativity and art and how that could be different from men's at that time in the way that it was respected and the way that women were treated. There is also a super creepy thriller kind of storyline running through it about a man called Silas who is a taxidermist and becomes obsessed with the main character Iris, and at times it had me just absolutely tense with fear about what was going to happen, but it was written so well and the streets of London were brought to life within the text. It's one of the best historical novels I have ever read, and I'd recommend it for fans of things like The Essex Serpent, which I found it was very similar to, but not so similar that this feels imitative. In fact, this is a totally original work that I would love everybody to read. If you love historical fiction, you need The Doll Factory in your life. 2019 was clearly the year of E.M. Forster because I also read Morris, and whilst I didn't love it as much as I loved Howard's End, I still adored it and I got so much out of this book. I think it is so underrated. I can't believe more people aren't talking about this book because it completely blew me away. This was published in 1971, although it was written between 1913 and 14. E.M. Forster wanted to wait until after his death for it to be published because it was a very personal book. This centres around the life of Morris, who is a gay man living at this time time. One of the best things about this book is that E.M. Forster set out with the idea that a happy ending was imperative. Lots of novels dealing with similar subjects at this time had the characters ending up with horrible fates. They would die, most likely, they would have horrible things happening to them, the couples would be split up. You could almost guarantee that a book like this would not have a happy ending. But E.M. Forster wanted that happy ending, and I think that he wanted it for himself as much as the characters. And so whilst Morris's journey isn't always smooth, there is hope at the end, and it is groundbreaking for that reason. It's an incredibly perceptive book with so many lines that I underlined and annotated because I just wanted to ingrain them in my memory. And Morris is a character that you can really warm to, and even though personally I couldn't relate to the scenes where he is at college and university, I still got it. It was the emotions for me rather than the situations that made me love this book as much as I did. It's got quite a famous adaptation starring Hugh Grant, which I haven't watched yet but would really like to, which I think is very popular across the internet, and it's actually one that I'd like to reread at some point soon, just because I think the next time I read it I'll get even more out of it. There was just too much on the first reading to absorb, but next time I'm going to really take my time with it, and hopefully I'll love it even more than I already do. A more recent release next, and also a book that I read right at the start of the year. This is Bird Cottage by Ava Meyer, and this has been translated from the original Dutch by Antoinette Fawcett. I love birds. I don't know if you know this about me, but other than books, birds are my obsession. I love watching birds, I love going out and discovering new birds and watching their habits. Everything about them to me is relaxing and calm and natural and just what I love most in the world. And so reading a book like Bird Cottage was basically a dream come true, because this is the fictionalised account of the life of Len Howard, who was a British ornithologist who wasn't particularly recognised during her lifetime, wasn't always taken seriously in her field, but did amazing work towards the understanding of birds, in particular great tits. And since reading this book I've got my hands on a copy of both of her books, and in there you can see pictures of her walking with birds all up her arms, because she lived in a place called Bird Cottage where the birds were allowed free rein, where she literally lived alongside the birds in this cottage in Sussex, which is basically my dream. So it does look at the way that women aren't taken seriously within scientific fields. It looks at giving up your dreams for greater dreams. It looks at country living and the nature that we surround ourselves with, and even though it is fictional, I found it very believable, and it has made me go away and find out more now about Len Howard and her life, which is always something that I enjoyed doing after reading a book that I have loved. Last year I featured Ellen Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables on my favourites list, and I fell in love with Anne and her amazing imagination. Since then I have read Anne of Avonlea, which I didn't love as much, but then in September I read Anne of the Island, and I think this is my favourite book in the Anne series so far. And I don't think that that will change. I think the next books in the series would have to be absolutely amazing and blow me away to dislodge this as my favourite, because what I loved about this is that you grow up with Anne in the first two books, and now she is grown up. She moves away to train as a teacher. You see her in a different realm as she navigates semi-adult life. She's not quite an adult yet, but she is getting there, and I loved how it took her relationship with Gilbert further in this book. You really see that blossom. You also see Anne make lots of mistakes. You see her treating people how she probably wouldn't want to treat them, how you see her develop relationships with other people and friendships, and also the animals in this book were also great. I think my favourite scene in this book was the final scene. Won't give any spoilers if you haven't read it, but I have read it many times since I read read it the first time and I can't get enough of it. I want to imprint it on my eyeballs so I can live the scene because it's so perfect. The perfect way to end this book. So I'm looking forward to reading the other books in the Anne series. Just feel like this is going to remain my favourite and I'm okay with that. I love it so much that I want it to be my favourite. Another author I discovered this year was Mary Elizabeth Braddon, or Emmy Braddon as she is sometimes known, and I read Lady Audley's Secret, and this sensation novel blew me away. I could not believe sometimes what I was reading and it felt so fantastic. Mary Elizabeth Braddon was one of the leading sensation novelists during the Victorian period, really helped to pioneer the genre, which came about because novels became cheaper to read. Authors were writing novels quicker because they were cheaper, so more people could access them, and sensation novels were kind of like the penny dreadfuls in that all these really extreme things would happen in them. They were about morality and about these characters who subverted that and were obviously horrifying because of it. And so you get this new genre coming in during the 1860s which pushes the boundaries of conventionality, and I love them. Lady Audley's Secret is about Lucy Graham, who has just married Sir Michael Audley to become Lady Audley, but she has a mysterious past. She was a governess when she met Sir Michael Audley, but before that it's like she was a blank slate. And you also have a young man called George Talboys who returns from Australia where he has made his fortune to discover that his wife has died. And when Lady Audley and George Talboys' lives collide, it's down to a character called Robert to solve the mystery, to work out what is going on, because some dark things are happening with the Audleys. One of the things I didn't expect when I started this book was just how beautiful the writing would be. I thought that because it was a sensation novel, I automatically assumed that the writing would be lesser, which was a stupid belief really, because the quality of writing and description was beautiful and really helped me to love this book more. It does have its faults in places, things that I wouldn't have liked to have been tied up as neatly as they were, or things I would have liked to have explored more in the book, and also the fact that Robert Audley is our saviour in the book at the expense of the female characters sometimes. But I love reading about anti-heroines, and Lady Audley's Secret has one of the best. So I really love this and can't wait to read more Mary Elizabeth Braddon very soon. Next up we have Ruth Goodman's How to Be a Victorian, which is a non-fiction book looking at the Victorian period, looking at people's lives and how everyday people lived during the Victorian era. I loved this because I love the Victorians so much and I got so much out of it. It's a book I keep referring to when I need to find out stuff, when I want to think about how people were living, and I think that this is one of the best non-fiction books I have ever read, which is something I've been enjoying a lot this year. I've really discovered a love for non-fiction that I didn't already have. So I loved How to Be a Victorian, and I have talked about it quite a bit, so I won't go into any more detail, but if you're looking for a book about the Victorian period and looking at everyday people's lives, then you need to read How to Be a Victorian. And then finally we come on to the final book, which is Beatrix Potter, A Life in Nature by Linda Lear. I love Beatrix Potter. She was my first obsession. So you might know how obsessed I am with the Brontes now, but before the Brontes there was Beatrix Potter. So I read all of her stories when I was younger. I was basically brought up on them. I was obsessed with all the characters and would have figurines of them. I went to Hilltop where she lived and worked. I was just Beatrix Potter mad. And since then I have gone back to my favourite stories. I have reread her in the past few years even, but I'd never read a full biography of her life. And A Life in Nature was a perfect example of what I love best about biographies, because what I really liked about this is that it incorporates lots of her letters, it looks at lots of primary sources, it doesn't go into things in a very simplistic way, so it does go into a lot of detail about her life, and actually I found that that was really good. That's what I like in a good biography. I don't want something that's going to be kind of basic. Once I'm reading something, I want to be reading it and I want to be getting lots out of it, as much out of it as possible. So I did think that that was a good example of what I am looking for in a biography. But the other thing that I really liked about it is that it doesn't just focus on her writing, but also about about the groundbreaking scientific discoveries she made. She was an amateur mycologist, but wasn't really an amateur because she could have gone so much further. But again, like I mentioned quite a few times in this video, she wasn't taken seriously. She did lots of detailed work and made amazing discoveries when it came to fungi, and lots of the first half of the book details this because that's what she did before she started writing. What I also loved about it was being able to look beyond her works and see her for the person she was, and she did so much amazing work that it just made me love her even more. So I think I might do a dedicated video to Beatrix Potter and her life and writing in a video next year, so keep an eye out for that because I feel like I want to talk about her a bit more on my channel. I feel like I haven't talked about her enough. So this was a great book to read towards the end of the year, and if you want to find out more about Beatrix Potter, I think this is probably the best biography you could read. So those were my favourite books of 2019. I'd love to know in the comments what your favourite books of the year have been and whether you have read any of the ones that I featured on my list, and I'm looking forward to an exciting year of reading in 2020. So I really hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you guys soon. Happy reading!